Thank you for joining me in this new series about Skyrim with Requiem, where I'm starting up a new character as a mage, and I'll be posting videos on this hopefully 3 times every week until the series gets done. Hit subscribe if you'd like notifications as I do that. This will be a 2-part video. In the first part, I'll be talking about some general concepts I use when starting a build. I spend a lot of time thinking about a character before I actually build it, because once you get going, completing a character can take 50, 60 hours or more of gameplay time, and it's frustrating to have to restart in the middle. In the second part of the video, I'll go over the specifics of the particular character that I intend to play. If that's all that interests you, there's a timestamp in the description, and you can just jump forward straight to there. But for our first part, I wanted to share some general concepts that I use when I'm making a new build. And I'll say there are 2 general ways to go about thinking of a character before you start to play it, and they can be complementary to each other. The first I'll call a front to back build, where you decide on your character's roleplay or its restrictions first, and then you just go about and play the game and try to advance yourself as best you can within those restrictions. So in the past, for example, I've played as a cursed werewolf character where I decided I would always wear the cursed ring of Hircine, and that can cause unpredictable werewolf transformations, then can result in you getting bounties in towns. The game becomes much more challenging because you might not have access to vendors, and so on. It's pretty fun and immersive, but it does run into problems as you go further into the game. Also, having certain restrictions on which skills or abilities you'll use, like in the last build I played with a ranger, I started with the restriction that I wouldn't do any factions and I wouldn't use any alchemy or enchanting, and I just wanted to see if I could complete the game with those restrictions in place. The advantage of doing a build this way is you can get it off the ground pretty quickly. It's the most immersive in terms of roleplay because you almost intentionally avoiding metagaming the content, so it can lead you to some pretty fresh and interesting experiences. The downside is that you may find yourself stuck in certain areas or having to grind up your skills in ways that are, in my opinion, less fun in order to tackle the endgame content, because your initial concept will have perhaps not a clear plan of how to advance through those areas. The second way to build a character, I'll call it back to front, where you begin with the goals or the quests that you primarily want to complete, and then you build backwards from there. And so, for example, a character whose only objective is to complete the Thieves Guild questline might have a much different path going forward than one that wants to complete the main quest, Dawn Guard, etc. The advantage of that is you have a clear idea of where you want your build to go and your progression as you go through different stages of the game. This may mean, however, that you start with skills that are not your final ones. And this is particularly true because many of the really strong skills in the game later on are not the ones that are going to be good for you early in the game. An easy example of this is heavy armor, which even if you're playing a melee character, you often don't want to start off in all heavy armor because it's heavy until you get perks in it. It makes it really hard to do combat because your stamina regenerates really slowly, and so on. So maybe you start with some other sort of build at the beginning and then hope to transition to heavy armor once you've trained it up a bit and gotten a few perk points there. Also, magic users can run into this as well because your early skills are often pretty weak against anything but the simplest of enemies, so you need to have some kind of alternate plan for how you're going to level your character at the beginning so that you can eventually progress to later stages of the game. And I think this is particularly the case because Requiem has such clear dividers between what are early, mid, and late game enemies. Even if they're not classified exactly as such, as you play through the game, you can definitely notice differences in the types and difficulties of enemies that you're going to fight. So early game enemies like bandits, for example, your biggest concern is usually keeping your stamina high, because that allows you to either run away or block attacks with a shield or be able to attack them sufficiently enough to not get surrounded. So early game, your biggest concern, I think, is stamina management within Requiem. As you start to proceed to the mid game, I think most characters are beginning to think about how they want to handle ranged attacks. For light armored characters or mages, those are arrows. For heavy armored characters, it starts to be more about spellcasters. And these enemies like Falmer or high-level bandits or Forsworn are much more dangerous at range, so you got to have some kind of a plan if you want to be able to advance through that content and level your character. Later in the game, the big issue becomes magic and elemental resists, because stuff like dragon priests, dragons, and the lightning attacks from Dwemer constructs start to become really dangerous and become a barrier to your progress unless you have some kind of plan in place in order to combat them. So if you're doing a back to front build, you can start with your late game plan, like, okay, how am I going to handle my magic and elemental resists once I get to the late game content? Then you start thinking, well, what are my mid game skills going to be so that I can find the gold and the gear that I need to get to my eventual late game setup, and then based on that, maybe you pick out the early skills you want to use so that you can get to the items and so on that you want for later parts of the game. And this may mean that the skills you use at the beginning of a character are very different from the ones that you're wanting to use at the end. And this is true for some character builds more so than others. If, for example, you're doing a one-hand warrior character, you can probably use your main skill right from the very beginning. Maybe you're not using your final weapon type, like maybe you eventually want to be using swords, but you start off with an axe because that's the best thing that you find early on, or vice versa. But for other builds, like heavy armored characters, you probably start off your character in light armor, slowly level up heavy armor more gradually, and then get to your final build at a later time. Or maybe if you're using a magic character like this one, I eventually want to be using illusion, but I'm starting off using mostly destruction magic. So both the front to back and back to front styles are good ways to go about building a character in Requiem. And I think the important part of it is just having some sort of a plan in place before you get going. And using both of them in conjunction, of course, makes the most sense. And the reason that I go over this is when I read the subreddit for Requiem, there are often questions people ask like, well, will this character be viable in the late game? Is this build going to be good enough? And the answer is usually you can make almost any build work in Requiem as long as you plan it out a little bit and have the game knowledge and willingness to go and do what's necessary. So the answer is you can make almost any build viable in Requiem as long as you have a sense of what you're going to be doing in the early, middle, and late game and how you'll transition in between those. So in the next part of the video, I'll talk more specifically about how I go through this as I'm planning out my Illusionist character, which I'm hoping will be a lot of fun. Stick around for another few minutes and I'll talk about that in more detail. Let's talk about the build. So the big restriction I'm putting on this character is I want to take every single one of the illusion perks. That's 15 perks in total. And illusion is a fantastic skill tree. It's got some defensive abilities like blur, it's got some summons once you get it high enough level, and it's got crowd control because you can turn enemies against each other. So I think it'll be really fantastic late in the game. But there are two big problems that you run into when doing an illusion-focused mage in my experience. The first problem is that illusion is absolutely terrible at lower levels. Early on, before you've got any perks in it, often it just won't even take effect on the enemies that you want it to hit, making it completely useless. So there needs to be some way to bridge the gap between levels 1 to 10 and then 10 to 20, and it's somewhere in the between 15 and 25 that I think I'll have enough perks into illusion to actually start making it useful as a primary skill. So I've got a couple of plans in order to bridge that gap. The first is I'm going to do a small focus into destruction magic. My plan is to go up this direction over toward Rune Mastery because that seems kind of on theme, setting traps for enemies that they'll run into. It also, once I get some electric runes, I'll be able to clear out Dwemer dungeons, which would otherwise take an extremely long time for illusion to be effective against them. I may also put a small investment into my one-handed skill because I'll be doing a lot of sneaking around, and so going up into these dagger-focused perks over here might be helpful. And also, I intend to use a crossbow early on in order to fight against mages and pick off archers, which I think will otherwise give me a lot of trouble until I get my illusion up to the point where it'll actually start defending against them. The second problem with illusion is that after you cast your first illusion spell, like say you cast an enraging orb on a group of enemies, they may not detect you right away, but they will start looking for the source of the spell, and that can cause them to aggro onto you instead of fighting each other as you would prefer that they do. So there's two different approaches that I could think of to try and resolve that problem of actually having to engage with enemies. The first option would be I could invest more into one-handed kind of heavily and put some points into heavy armor so that I'd actually have a fighting chance when the enemies came after me. But I decided after some thought that I don't really want to do a heavy armored character because I really like having a high movement speed and being agile in combat. So instead, what I think I'll do is invest more points into the sneak skills. Since I intend to do pretty much exclusively robes, then I can take advantage of all of these stealth perks and hopefully just be so evasive and use illusion spells so that they're not able to find me. I may also go up this direction as well, so that I can use more dagger sneak attacks, because using daggers while coming out of invisibility sounds kind of awesome. But that's my main plan, is I want to be leveling illusion. I'll probably drop as much of my gold into training that up for about the first 10 levels or so, and once I've got it above 40, I think it'll start to become a lot more viable, but until then I'll have to be relying on my other skills and my combat abilities to get me through. For other magic, I'm planning a small investment into Conjuration. I'll probably just take this Novice and then up to the Apprentice Conjuration perks, because that gives access to the Spectral Warhound, which is a fantastic early companion. Also, just having another skill I can level to get some character level ups is going to be to my benefit. Otherwise, I might get stuck and not be able to train as much as I want to. Destruction I've already talked about a little bit. I'll probably put somewhere between 6 and 8 points into Destruction just so I have it as a backup skill. And realistically, for doing stuff like dragons, if I want to advance the main quest line, Illusion, at least as far as I know, doesn't have any great ways to deal with dragons. Maybe I'll discover one as I go further into the game. Restoration, I think that the Focused Mind perk over here is more or less a requirement if you want to do a mage build, because the increased magicka regeneration is very helpful. I might go up here into Power of Life. I'm not entirely sure about that and how useful it'll be, but I definitely want to be taking these Apprentice, Adept, and so on restoration perks, because again, Illusion will take a very long time before it starts being effective against undead, and I want to be able to use Sunfire to clear out Draugr dungeons when sneaking is not being effective enough. And I want to get up here into Mysticism eventually, because I think that will make my illusion spells more likely to be effective against higher level undead. One problem I expect this character is going to have is, since the High Elves have a -40 to magic resistance, I don't have any great way to get high resistances later in the game and fight against spells. I haven't put a lot of emphasis on wards in my previous playthrough. They're kind of hard to use, but I'm thinking that I'll probably, once I've got restoration high enough, hopefully I'll be able to use wards to protect myself against enemy spells. We'll see how that goes. I haven't had great success with it before, but maybe once I put some effort into gaining skill in that area, I'll get better at it. I've decided for this character I'm not going to do any alteration. Part of that is that alteration spells are pretty expensive, and if you have to cast them at the start of combat, it can cut into your magicka for using other abilities. And being that the main way to level alteration is with mage armors, I think that's going to be hard to do, because illusion spells are also quite mana intensive. It would be very nice to get up into these magic resistance perks to offset some of the Altmer downside, but I don't think I'm going to have enough perks to even make that practical. Enchanting, I intend to go up along this side of the enchanting tree, because I want to be able to craft myself some better illusion gear to reduce my spell costs. Smithing, I'm definitely going to go up into advanced blacksmithing once I'm able to. I want to be able to craft jewelry that'll also let me level up my enchanting more quickly, and I may go over to dwarven smithing just so that I can improve a dwarven crossbow to use and have some bolts, because otherwise I think enemy mages are going to give me trouble, at least until very late in the game, and I don't want to be stuck behind that content. I've decided against heavy armor. I don't think I'll be doing enough combat to make block useful. Small investment in one-handed. I may put one perk into marksman just because it gives more armor piercing for crossbows and makes them more effective, but I'll have to judge that and see how many I've got. On the evasion side, I'm undecided so far as to whether I want to go up into the dodge perk. I think that is potentially very useful because it'll give me more chance of surviving in melee combat, but again, that's one I'll have to wait and see on. And lockpicking, I'll have to take these 3 perks into it eventually because I'm not doing alteration. I'll need to level lockpicking, and well, that's no big deal. Speech, the haggling perk is a necessity for basically every character, otherwise you can't sell anything effectively. And I may go over here into Indomitable Force so that later in the game I'm not quite as dead if I get shouted at. Alchemy, I've decided for this character I'm not going to invest any perks into alchemy. For one, I don't like the effect it has on the economy. I've got a whole video about the alchemy system in Requiem. You can check that out if you're curious about more of my thoughts on that. And also, I just don't think I'll have enough perks to do it. But because the High Elves have a proficiency in alchemy, I will still be able to create some very basic potions. So I'm going to pick up ingredients here and there in a kind of a selective way. Hopefully I'll pick up a few levels in alchemy, even though I won't be putting any perks there. That'll give me some small utility, like having some more restore magicka and so on stuff, which can otherwise be kind of a barrier if you're playing as a mage. So that's my plan for this Illusionist Mage. As you can see, it's not a quote-unquote pure Illusionist because I'm going to be using some other skills along the way, but my hope is that Illusion will be the big emphasis of it, and I'm looking forward to see how that goes. I'll have quite a few more videos coming out in this series. I'm going to go do Bleak Falls Barrow next, just to make an attempt and see if I can do it at level 1. And so stick around, hit subscribe if you'd like notifications on updates as this series continues.